Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Think Bunker. Today, this brief is going to be on the history of the combat rifle. Now, before we begin, I'd like to take a little bit of time to kind of do a little bit of give you some insight into what the plan here is. And if you look at our videos, what we're going to do from here is do a general history of pieces of equipment, say planes, ships, and their basic configuration. It kind of has as the world adopts, and because generally the world, at least the first world nations, will adopt equipment relatively similar to each other, or at least in concept. Or they have a requirement, and each country has a requirement very similar to each other's requirement, with a few changes due to local stuff. And as a result, we're gonna do a video like this where we discuss the general consensus of combat rifles throughout history, and then we'll go into the individual rifles or collection of service rifles that each country had. And then if we have any outstanding or very iconic arms or vehicles, we'll go do a separate video on those. Take the Ft-17 video, for example. And from there, we're just going to do a general cover of all the bases, the general build and overview of each, iconic piece of iconic machine, and then we'll go into the specific nations and so on and so forth. So that's just to give you some insight into what we're doing and the plan we're going to be doing going forward. So, with that said, the history of combat rifles, I am joined by my co-host, Ingrid Siburns, and then our historian, well, I say historian, our, at this point, the man I go to for, hey, I have a question on something about history, he's back to me in about 10 minutes with an entire lore of the human race from the year 1 to the year 2000. I'm not even joking, it's that quick. And from there, we're beginning. We begin with the hand cannons and the fire lances. So, with fire lances, the general idea starting off was that essentially these are to spew fire more than they do shoot a projectile. There have been instances and documentation of things which trust me, Kento's going to get into in a minute.
I can't. I'm waiting. I'm waiting.
Hang on. Hey, hold it in for a second. It's like trying to hold in a piss on a road trip. Anyways, the consensus of this thing was to launch fireballs at people, and it was more of a psychological warfare thing than anything, because imagine even if you're in heavy armor and you're charging a line, and all of a sudden this dude with a stick walks up and just fireball and just lights your friend on fire, or even launches a fireball at you. It's going to be a brown pants moment. That's definitely for sure. And another instance I've seen of fire lances used or read documentation of they be ideal to use against cavalry. Instead of trying to fight someone on a horse with a pole arm, you can run up to them with a fire lance, light the match, and when it goes off, it scares the horse or the man mounted on the horse, either one or both. And it can disrupt a cavalry charge. That was the general consensus, and sometime along the line, as humans do, the old wheel started turning, and someone takes some pebbles and drops it into the barrel, and then launches, and then lights it then, because they just wanted to see if it would work, and it would in some cases. That's when we kind of start seeing the use of, as you could call, shot, but it wasn't really exactly doctrine with European fire lances. They were more so just psychological stuff. The hand cannon, on the other hand, was the ones up top. And actually, real quick, the photo on the top left is a great consensus of how these things work, and that's a matchlock, or a match. The way it works, you strike a match and you hold it near the powder. There's either a fuse or just straight powder, and it takes a while to go off in comparison to even muskets with flintlocks and caplocks. But it can take a second because the powder at this time is very unrefined. I think that's the right term, unrefined. You ever seen in Western movies where
you would part of it is refinement, part of it is some of these you have to remember that black powder was mixed by hand. Individuals were making this stuff. So some people mixing the black powder wouldn't do a particularly good job, and some people would. And you also have to remember that the saltpeter, the charcoal, and the sulfur, they make a mixture. They are not a new material, and given their different granular size, what in some cases would happen. So if you, in some cases, when they were transporting this stuff over many miles over open terrain, the shaking of the carts or the shaking on the soldiers would actually separate the material. So you could wind up getting different percentages in a single barrel. So if you scooped out some powder, one scoop may be 40% charcoal, and another scoop is like 60%, like 70% sulfur. And you have to have a good mix to get a good, consistent explosion, which is why the Europeans in I think it was like early 1400s, they developed this thing called corn powder, where they would intentionally mix water into the gunpowder, and basically it would form into these large clumps that were easier to transport. You wouldn't have to worry about the material separating. And whenever you went into battle, what you would do is you'd re-break up the material, get the water out of the material, break it up again, remix it, and you wouldn't have to worry about the materials separating.
Right, so all in all, it's just these things can take a while to go off or sometimes it's depending on the powder mixture that you have on hand, as Kinto mentioned, and thank you for that, by the way.
No problem, anytime.
But either way, as with most things, the thing we have now is a far cry from what it started as its baby steps. But
praise the Lord for smokeless powder.
No kidding. If you watch any Western movie and there's a lot of powder, there's a lot of thick, smoky gunshots, that's because we were still using, you could call it black powder, but it was just still lesser refined powder than what we have now, and as a result of innovation throughout the years, we've moved away from smoky powder to smokeless powder to what we have now. But the hand cannon itself, the purpose of that was to be a utility weapon, where if you're attacking a facility and there's a barricade that's protecting enemy soldiers, your crossbows and your bows ain't going through that, and it's instead of sending your melee guys to go fight it, you could just bring up the hand cannon. See the picture in the back. By the way, the picture in the background is called the Chong. I just want to point that out. And the picture on the top right, wherein you would aim this thing at the barricade in question, load it, and proceed to put a hole through. Because although, yes, these things went off, produced a lot of smoke, and were kind of inconsistent in their pressures, the functionality they provided was unmatched in this era.
For the Chong, the fire lances, which first appeared in the Jin Song War in the 1200, late 1200s, the fire lance had an effective range if it had something loaded in it, nails, bits of metal, rock, of about 10 feet was its maximum lethal damage. From most sources, these things were not flamethrowers, these were not shotguns, this was You have to stick this in somebody's face. This is a pipe bomb.
A pipe bomb on a stick. Love that.
Forget mailbox pipe bombs. Get it, hand deliver them.
Be a man and confront the man to his face and pipe bomb him in the face.
I believe in Great Wall China. I will stab you in the face with spear and then blow your face off with pipe bomb improvised from Ming Dynasty.
What? Okay, whenever I...
Sorry,
Go ahead, Sideburns.
Okay. So, back to... We talked about this a little bit earlier. So, one of the problems with a weapon like these, Fire Lance and all that, is that, you know, back at this point in time, you'd say, it's kind of a newer thing. One of the issues about, you'd say, like actually having a projectile, something that can actually hit somebody and kill somebody, is the fact that, you know, they're fairly hard to produce. I'd imagine you can see do their basic construction. It's a lot of materials. It takes a lot of work, and there's no, what do you call it? It's hard to make things built to a specific standard. Right, so it's not about if I was going to make ammunition for something like this. I'll talk about this a little bit later. But they had a special way of actually making ammunition, say for like muskets. It's a particular process, but that wouldn't be discovered till, you know, I'm assuming fairly far after this point.
Now
1500s,
you could argue, like late 1500s.
I mean, you could argue like grape shot, you know, like shrapnel of some sort. But one of the problems is adding extra obstructions into the barrel adds, you know, recoil to an extent. And when you're holding it like a lance, I'm sure you've seen videos of people with like a Desert Eagle and they've got like a limp wrist or something, and it goes flying out of their hand. It's something similar to that. I'm sure you can imagine the kind of idea. And looking at how you have to fire this thing, you have to fire it one-handed. I can imagine where there'd be some slight issues with that.
Yeah, there's no way to get leverage or grab it. Once you said that, I'm immediately reminded of all those videos I see of people trying to like one-hand 12 gauges, and it just slides out of their hand and flies behind them.
Videos where people, for some reason, when they fire shotguns, in order to, you know, the whole purpose of firing a weapon into your shoulder like a rifle or a shotgun is to, so the weapon doesn't go flying backwards, they'll put the stock above their shoulder, fire it, and the shotgun inexplicably, for some reason, just flies behind them.
I don't get those. It's not hard to fire a shotgun. It doesn't even have that much recoil.
Yeah, not in comparison to definitely not in comparison to a bolt action or even some inertia-driven semis. Anytime I see the Fire Lance and I think of the operation of it, I always think of that one really that one meme where it's winter time, fireball.
I love that so much.
It's that because there
Cast
was a bit of a,
fireball, fireball.
Part of the psychological aspect of the Fire Lance in particular was that it's mostly to do with the fact that there's a ball of fire headed your way, but it also could be a paranoia from witchcraft, because now you have essentially some guy could interpret it as, oh, they're using battle mages because this guy walked up with a stick and now he just lit my friend on fire. But it's mostly just to do with the fact that he's on fire now because a guy pointed a stick at him and now he's on fire.
Yeah, I don't think most soldiers are questioning the deep religious implications of this rather than that dude is now on fire.
I'm more so talking about, you're right, and I'm more so thinking about it's kind of like a psychological fear where it's news of this thing spreads and to other villages that are being conquered, and oh
yeah, I mean some of this stuff is
they have battle mages.
I mean, you've got stuff like the Huacha in China, where it's a bunch of these rockets strapped to arrows. You got about 100 tubes, and it might not be that effective in actually killing people, but dang man, that's scary. That you're basically seeing this brand new concept. Most of your soldiers have got no idea what is going on. It wasn't like they would see this and then immediately start routing. The flying arrows is not something new to them. They understand most of the concept. but it's questioning, can we win this battle? It's these thoughts bouncing around inside of soldiers' heads. And then when they meet the enemy, they're more timid, they're more prone to shattering or fleeing from the battlefield.
Nerves are incredibly heightened.
These things do not win battles. Most of the battles that these things took place in, they were not the game changer when they first came out, but they were a part of it. One of the more terrifying weapons was using these things as mines, or bombs, where they would either use leather bags, like animal skin bags, sewn up, filled with the powder, and then some sort of long fuse, and trying to, through a couple of different ways, chuck it into the enemy lines. There was a kind of catapult that they used. It wasn't a trebuchet because it didn't have a counterweight, if I remember correctly. Or using the bomb in something like a very large cannon, which the cannon came out way before these things. Probably about 50 to 60 years before we start seeing fire lances. Both the bamboo and metal fire lances. And the cannons lobbing these very large shells or bombs into the opponents is definitely going to be the more terrifying thing on the battlefield.
It just adds to the psychological factor.
Correct.
And as mentioned earlier, can be effective against cavalry in that you scare the horses or even the main mounted.
Yeah, like the Romans deploying the cattle drops.
Man.
Or I forget who it was using barbed wire on horses, because horses just do not vibe with anything spiky on the ground.
Yeah, I wonder why. Then again, neither did humans, but you know.
Oh yeah, it's got to be fun stepping on a solid steel cattle trap built by the Romans with you as the mighty Gaul soldier with your bare feet. Not necessarily bare feet, but you'd have like a leather shoe or like a wooden bottom shoe, if you were lucky.
Yeah, but with that said, that's all I have for this slide.
It's a very poignant start, and these things do spread rather fast when they first pop up in the late 1200s. They would get into Europe by the late 1300s, about roughly 100 years, give or take. Mostly passing through the Silk Road and not necessarily as the weapons, but the idea behind them, or the some other version of this, like fireworks being brought over and then being reapplied to military usage. The first battle that these things were used, gunpowder was used by European troops. I think it's the Battle of Ciresi in 1348. But those were not rifles. They were like a mixture of Reboilicans and like some sort of bombard-style cannon. A Reboilican is basically just a bunch of barrels on a cart. When I say barrels, I mean gun barrels. A bunch of pipes laid out on a cart that are lit and then fire.
So, a European version of the Chinese rocket cart.
Yeah. Organ gun. Or organ gun. That's a good way to describe
Oh
it.
yeah. That thing. Yeah. All right. Is there anything else anyone would like to say?
Not really. I think I'm good here because we're talking about just this as a basic concept. This is your introduction. We've introduced you to something. Please go out and search more of it.
Oh yeah. If you ever have, also on a side note, if you ever have any questions, ideas, or you want to share an opinion, feel free to do so.
Please ask me questions. It brings me joy.
Mm-hmm. Sideburns, how about yourself?
I think that's all for me.
All right.
I think we're good.
I like what you brought
All right,
up.
Wait. Moving on, we're gonna go to the evolution. The arquebus and the musket. So, as you see with the weapons in the top right and bottom left of the screen, these have a very similar issue to what Cyburns brought up previously. Thank you, Cyburns, for that, by the way. And matchlock, and as a result, you couldn't hold it like a rifle because you couldn't stabilize the end of the weapon with the far end of the weapon with your other hand because you had to hold the weapon and light the fuse and the powder. And I've discussed how that could be it's a time-consuming process, and so the reaction is not instantaneous. And the issue with the arquebus, although now, as technology progressed, what the arquebus does is allows the weapon to focus the pressure of the explosion that sends the projectile out of the barrel, allowing you to penetrate heavy armor. In in one of Laserpig's videos, he brought up the first adaptation of firearms in their comparison to the crossbow. Many people despise the firearms to the crossbow because the crossbow was significantly cheaper, required much less work to make, and you could produce hundreds or thousands of these things depending on the manufacturing process you have. So, what's the point of the arquebus? What's the point of the firearms? Well, these things, due to the amount of pressure, the insane amounts of pressures these things could build up, sometimes could be catastrophic and blow up in the guy's face, the operator's face. But ignoring that, if you focused correctly and fired it would go through heavy armor. However, with arquebuses specifically, as you see with these images I've just noted, it can take a while to set up, and you can be exposed while doing so. From there, the muskets, i.e., flintlocks and caplock rifles, were developed that would increase and speed up the firing process exponentially. No longer did you have to set up the stand to keep the the weapon steady, and the firing of the weapon was much more instantaneous because roughly in this time, powder started your manufacturing process for powder was becoming a little more standardized, and methods to keep the powder ratios that Kincho mentioned earlier more consistent while firing was also becoming around. But our overall, muskets were a ergonomic upgrade, actually, revolution to the arquebus, allowing you to be more mobile with your weapon and to engage a target more accurately.
This was also the first time that, especially around the end of the arquebus, they start adding threads to the inside of the barrel. This was done to add a spin to the projectile that was being fired, which would increase accuracy. And while the performance was definitely increased for producing these threaded barrels and increasing the accuracy of the guns, even through flintlock muskets and rifles, the production process for the threaded barrels was still far in excess of smoothbores, and it was not feasible for most countries to field threaded barrels. and instead adopted tactics like um, rank and file to handle the lower accuracy because it just was not feasible to outfit 30,000 men with threaded rifle barrels for a lot of these armies.
Real quick, I'd like to point out the fact that of all the weapons we've just covered, technically they're not rifles. Right, muskets that have rifled barrels, those are definition-wise technicality. Those are rifles because they have rifling inside. That's where that term comes from. So technically, the arquebuses aren't rifles, but
Technically, some of these are considered cannons. Some of them are considered pistols. Some of this is just utter nonsense, and it is what it is. Keep in mind while they're figuring this out, there are certain people who are cooking up some pretty nutty ideas, the basically semi-automatic musket that was built in Norway. I think it was late 1700s when they were cooking that up, where basically you would fire it, you would recharge the firing mechanism and re-add powder, and you could fire it again until you ran out of charges inside of the gun. It was a great leap forward, but the guns were handmade and they were super expensive. Most of them were just collector's pieces when they were manufactured, and they never made more than, I think, about a couple thousand of them throughout the time they were making them. So some of these some of these things where you've got stuff that looks like a pistol, it's technically a rifle, that's a carbine, that's a blunderbuss, so that's a shotgun, or a cannon if you look at it from a certain perspective. You've got a lot of stuff cooking up around this time, so this is where you're actually seeing rifles for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
But they were more expensive than the cost did not outweigh the benefits. So most armies took a look at it, said, "Hey, this is just too expensive. We're going to have to go with something else. We can maybe give our Royal Guard this." But
or people using Sharps rifles and such.
Sharps are.
Excuse me. Sharps wouldn't come about until later.
1860s.
Yeah, that's when you started. And in fact, that's actually where the sharpshooter term comes from sharp rifles, Sharps rifles, which are.
We'll get there. Now, a lot of individuals wound up buying rifles for hunting and other such recreational activities because they wanted to be able to actually hit their targets, hit the deer, hit the fox, and smoothbore muskets were not going to cut it. Some people did use them. You can't afford a rifle, use a musket. Turkey will die the same.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually a really big market where you get a lot of the crazier, like multi-shot flintlock pistols, double-barreled muskets.
Man. Quad-barrel shotguns, I remember that was a thing.
America built a quad-barreled shotgun.
Yeah, no, I remember that was a thing. I saw
no,
this...
we built it in the 50s and 60s.
I remember seeing a pistol. It was basically a pepper gun. It was like 22 barrels on a single pistol. Your wrist after that.
So do you know about the It was basically a revolutionist's shotgun. We built it in like the 50s and 60s. The idea was that you could drop this four-barreled shotgun behind enemy lines to American supporting forces, and that they the with four barrels, regardless of how bad they were with the gun, they would hit something.
And with that logic, of course, they gave him a shotgun as well. Uh, yeah. Anyways,
The um, all of these have a similar firing mechanism. With arquebuses and those style of firearms, they use a serpentine matchlock system, where basically once you lock into place and pull the trigger, the serpentine arm will dunk itself into the serpentine arm that's holding the wick will dunk itself into the pan, or where the gunpowder that's outside of the barrel is located, which ignites the powder inside the barrel, which forces the projectile out. For flintlocks, it's the same firing mechanism. You're just getting rid of the wick and serpentine arm. You have a adjustable arm to hold on to a piece of flint and strike it on a tongue of steel, which sparks and ignites the powder in the pan. And percussion caps were just the same arm, same trigger mechanism, but would fall onto a cap, and the pressure inside of the when you hit it with a hammer would basically launch a jet of sparks down through a hole into the barrel where the other powder is to launch the projectile out. It's the same firing mechanism effectively. It is just streamlining it, making the process more efficient, and making it easier for the end user. And that just changed as technology got more and more advanced.
Mm-hmm. As I stated earlier, it was an ergonomic revolution to the arquebus, the muskets, and the caplocks, or flintlocks. That's all I have for this slide. Sideburns, Kento?
I think Sideburns wanted to talk about the bullet manufacturing or something.
Yes, yes.
Yes,
So,
yes.
when it comes to the bullet manufacturing, it's kind of interesting. So, yeah, that's the main form. I think all the way used all of in the Civil War and all that. We were talking specifically about the bullets, talking about lead, typically. So, one reason is that it's easy to melt. So, one of the methods, or one of the most common methods, that they'd have these large towers, and it's kind of funny. At certain distances, if you drop the metal off certain distances, you get different sized chunks of metal or balls of metal, but when they're dropping through the air, they're slowly cooling, but they're in the form of basically a perfect circle. So by the time they get to the bottom, they splash into the water at the bottom, they've already cooled to a basic shape, and as soon as they hit the water, they've now hardened into a perfect, spherical ball. I know they've used a whole bunch of different materials, of course, and I you've probably even heard they used clay for certain parts when ammo was low, but for that's later on for rifles. But for specifically musket balls, the technology for making like a unified shape, of course, didn't come along till a little bit later on than when we were talking about cannons and the like fire lances. But once they had it down, you had bores of certain sizes for guns, and they were way better at unifying that process, of course, with slight tolerance differences, but they were able to make the actual musket balls, is what they call them. They're actually able to make those to a specific size standard with relative efficiency. Just interesting how they figure that out.
That way of producing the projectile ammunition I've heard of stuff like that being used. Most militaries, after the most militaries with large contingents of black powder weaponry or firearms, most of that was made in stuff like steel molds or cast iron molds. What they would do is basically pour in cast iron into a sand mold or clay mold, and the cast iron shape would have divots in it for the balls. So what you would you'd basically have two pieces of cast iron that would sandwich together, and you would pour in molten lead, because lead's got a super low melting point, well below like cast iron. So
it's only regarded as one of the softest metals that exists, except for sodium.
I forget what it's.
But they tend to get, but sodium gets a little agitated when exposed to water.
Oh yeah, I love alkaline metals.
I was gonna say, so when it comes to, I was talking about the towers, you can actually still find those towers around. I don't know if they're typically
they would have to be in Europe.
No, they have them. They have them in the U.S. I do believe they have them in the U.S. I could look that up. I do believe for the Civil War specifically, they did have some of those.
I know they had one down in the Augusta. I think it was the Augusta Powder Works, but that was destroyed whenever.
What are you talking about?
That was destroyed when the.
No, Augusta Powder Works is still there.
No. The tower. Like yeah, the tower was destroyed.
No, I was about to say, because Augusta Powder Works was one of the very lucky manufacturing places that didn't get destroyed by Sherman.
Oh yeah, exactly. A Sherman, the Sherman.
It was. You've been fed a lie. It was not William Tecumseh Sherman. It was actually an M4A3 with a hat on. Everyone's just too scared to tell you otherwise.
In fact, William Tecumseh Sherman was named after the tank that was named after him. With that in mind, that's all I have for this one. If does anyone else have anything else?
So I'm just thinking, going in my head, they would have to be doing that for the muskets, because rifles, the Confederacy had a lot of black powder muskets that were basically grandfathered in to the Army, because someone walked off their farm and in the Army and they have their musket. But for the Confederacy, the majority of their ammunition, along with the Union, was the more bullet-like lead ball. Last time I tried to explain this, I had a stroke and got it all backwards. But basically, it was a lead formed in the shape of something closer to what we would see with bullets following the American Civil War, with ridges on the back, which those have to be made in a mold, but with stuff like standard lead musket balls, at least mass-produced ones, dropping them from a tower is fine. I always kind of forget that the Confederacy had a large contingent of muskets.
Yeah, a lot of them were just either grandfather weapons or liberated from former Union soldiers.
Union had a bunch of percussion cap weapons. Um, at least on the east for the armies on the east coast.
Yeah, I was when I said that I was referring to the arms as a whole.
Oh
The
yeah,
rifles.
they were either stolen Union weapons or it was repurposed American weapons before the Civil War. Although there were a few things that were sort of imported, but only at the beginning, and they were only in very small batches.
I would once again like to talk about musket balls.
That is perfectly fine.
Okay.
Please proceed.
After
Talk about your balls.
thank you. After thoroughly consulting my notes, to clear up any misconceptions, these they're called shot towers. The thing I was describing, and they're actually the most common method of producing. They're the most common method of producing, shot balls for muskets, all the way from the 18th century to the 1960s.
What?
And you can still find them, of course, all over the place. Some in Iowa, there's some in Maryland,
Iowa.
I have.
There you go.
yeah, all the way up, all the way
Actually,
across the coast.
thinking about it, that doesn't surprise me anymore.
Pennsylvania,
Mm.
Philadelphia.
I think
Oh
Pennsylvania-
shoot! These things.
Yeah. But yeah, so they were the most common way of making that particular type of ammo. Of course, from what I've seen from diagrams, one that I didn't mention. So they have these big grates, and you kind of pour the liquid into it, and they only pour out a certain amount of lead, molten lead, and that certain amount of molten lead would fall down, so that'd be the correct size.
This is a shot
But
tower.
while falling, they would cool into the right shape, end up at the bottom into a giant water basin.
Imagine the
Very
person. Imagine who, like John Shot Tower, who came up with the concept of this thing. Hey, what crack was he smoking?
I know these. I know
Hey,
what.
can I have some? There you go.
What's getting me, or what was getting me, is the 1860s. I do apologize. The because or the 1960s, I would not imagine these being used, because who needs musket balls in the 1960s? Cheese. Because I don't think you can get. You would have to do a substantial amount of filing to get a rifle, rifle shaped ball. I mean, I guess you could if you had someone who's that determined. But for stuff like musket balls and small, like canister shot, I can see that.
Yes. For this, so for the sake of time on that, we've spent a lot of time on the this slide in particular. For unless anyone has anything else to say, let's. I motion that we continue.
Yes, please.
That's hey, it's not that big of a problem. I mean, we're just about to start a fight over musket balls. I mean, I just don't be concerned.
Yeah, don't. Yeah, I definitely do not have these people locked hostage in my basement. Anyways, moving on.
Let us out. Let us out. Let us out.
That you are not in my basement. I don't have a basement. I wish I did. Moving
I made
on, we're
one.
gonna. How did you get over here that quick? Anyway, moving on, we're gonna move to the breech-loaded rifles. Now, I will say, technically, every rifle, your pistols, your say your slide-operated pistols, or even your ARs, your AKs, they're all breech-loaded because technically, that's just a funny thought to me, which means the tiny man in my AR is doing a lot of work. with that said, breech-loaded rifles were an attempt to expedite the process of loading the weapons. Because if you don't know, if you've been living under a rock for however long, the way you would load these weapons was, well, muskets previously, was by taking your powder and pouring it down your barrel, taking your wadding, typically cotton or just cloth, again, cotton.
Cotton, wax paper. It was either cotton or wax paper. The cotton had to be treated, but any sort of sabo.
It's anything
Wadding.
to wadding to protect the ammunition from the impact of the pressure of the ignition of the powder, and then you're shot, and you would take a stick that's typically connected to the end of your barrel or just below, and you'd pull it out, stuff it down your barrel. This process would take a little bit. The breech-loaded rifles are an attempt to expedite it. Actually, well, not an attempt. They expedited the process. I've seen some examples where there are black powder, non-cartridge breech-loaded rifles, but those were quickly done away with and succeeded by the idea of the trapdoor rifle on the top right, wherein they would start to also expedite the loading process, create cartridges that had everything you needed in one fell swoop right there. Furthermore, this is another thing. This would prevent soldiers from literally blowing themselves up because they overloaded their muskets, or underloading their muskets and having performance issues, and God forbid there be a jam. Those did happen sometimes. Most of the time it was just overloading your rifle and causing your rifle to blow up in your face. Not a good thing to happen. Wouldn't recommend it. Don't Kentucky ballistics yourself with that stuff. And this was a way so soldiers didn't have to do the math. They could just load in a bullet. It was already predetermined. It was a preset amount of powder already in a cartridge, obviously. And so once the issue with trapdoors, the U.S. Army did adopt the trapdoor, but it wasn't for long because the ammo capacity was one. It was literally one. There was no. It was only one shot. After this came the repeating rifles around the 1860s. These things worked pretty well, although not nearly as accurate as the trapdoor, because at the time the rifles were in three parts: the forward assembly, including the barrel and the grip, the stock, and then the actual moving components in the middle. Over time, with multiple shots, you would end up the components being held together would kind of loosen a bit, which would impact accuracy greatly. This would take a little bit of time, but it did happen. And so, if poorly maintained and not constantly readjusted and sighted in, you just lost accuracy in comparison to that of the trapdoor, where it's one solid piece and a barrel in it. However, when at closer ranges, these things were great in operation. Against the Confederacy, the Union would utilize these rifles as shorter range rifles, to where once closing the distance, the repeaters could just pull these things out and start rapidly repeating shots. And the Union said, "Oh man, this works great. What's the cost? What's the bill? Oh, we're gonna go bankrupt," because the ammunition was expensive to produce these things at the time. And on top of that, you give a soldier anything at all, they're gonna use it. I kid you. There's a reason why we don't give the ability for soldiers just to use Moabs, because if you had a scenario where you were attacking a facility, and you gave the soldiers attacking the facility one Moab to use, the first thing they see, they're probably going to use it on. I say that with some sincerity. Basically, if soldiers are in a combat situation, when they're in the combat situation where their lives are at risk, they're going to mag dump.
Well, I mean, I would expect them to do that.
And they tend to do that, and the U.S. budget did not like that.
I do have one quick question. So, did you just say that they had trapdoor and then replaced them with repeating?
No. What I was saying was that the U.S. Army did adopt the trapdoor rifle. The British looked at adopting a trapdoor rifle. However, the U.S. Was looking at it, ended up adopting it, but never really used it. They never ever replaced because they
We,
because they're because
the British and the Americans got a whole lot of use out of these things.
the trapdoor.
Yeah, that would. Sharps was a trapdoor. The Sharps rifle was a trapdoor.
Yes.
The technically the Martini Henry is a weird amalgamation of both a lever action and a trapdoor, which was used like 1880s by Britain. Martini Henry, I've got it in my notes.
My point was
Never mind.
that hmm,
I don't have it in my notes. I forgot to write down the date for my notes. I'm a sham.
I must have conveyed that incorrectly, and what I was attempting to say was that the in no capacity was the trapdoor to be used as a frontline infantry weapon, kind of like the Henry repeating rifle was. Like, you don't want to use the sharps or the trapdoor as at close range, because it's faster to load than a musket and or a flintlock for sure. But these things weren't meant to be used at closer ranges. These were called, well, they were marksman rifles for a reason.
Well, the problem is in this style of warfare, you just don't do CQB, and if you do CQB, you better either have a pistol or prepare to fire once and then bayonet charge the second person.
Mm-hmm.
Because like CQB just does not work with a lot of these weapons, because like if you're a mighty Prussian soldier and you hop over the French barricade, or the palisade, and you fire your shot and he fires his shot, and you both miss. I mean, what do you? Okay, hang on, dude. Let me just reload real quick. You're so dead when I get done reloading. Oh, you think, you German man? I'm going to shoot you in the face whenever I get finished reloading.
You're just arguing semantics if you both miss your shot.
Yeah, what's going to happen is devolve into fist fight.
Mm-hmm.
Stick your bayonet in him or beat him over the head with the butt of your gun. If that fails, ask someone else to shoot him.
All right. Well, that's all I have for this section.
I think this is all I have. The army did love these things, though. The army did love them, especially cavalry.
Correct. Real quick, though, as I mentioned earlier, the actually, hold on, Sideburns, do you have anything to say on this section?
I don't have anything for this one now.
Sweet. So we're gonna move on real quick. The issue with the trapdoors and levers was that, as mentioned earlier, you kind of had a lack of accuracy with the repeaters, but well, I say lack of. It's not as if it's you walk up to somebody and you're within a foot and you pull the trigger and you completely miss. No, it's it's just in comparison to a sharps, you have a lack of accuracy because of the multiple sections of the rifle you have in comparison to a trapdoor. But the trapdoor lacked ammunition capacity, and the repeater lacked in the effective range. This is the end of part 1. Due to YouTube time constraints and the algorithm, we like to cut this video here and cut it into 2 parts if it's too long. As such, you'll see the next part, I believe, next week or tomorrow, whichever one. It depends on what the editor's doing. But with that said, thank you for watching the video. Now, please, get back to work.